Covfefe and commentary. I'm your host, Miss Day. There was a poster of Marcus Garvey hanging on the wall in my second grade classroom. It was such a stark contrast to the other black leaders around him that I'd stare at it. In fact, I found it somewhat repulsive. Next to it was Muammar Gaddafi, smiling with a huge afro and wearing a dashiki. He looked similar to my father, but the image of Garvey left me vexed. The beady eyes and robust jaws didn't resemble anyone I knew. But according to my teacher, he was a hero, someone to be admired. It was 1979, and Mrs. Horn had a tendency towards black nationalism, despite her uncanny knack for excluding children who weren't from middle-class families. You knew exactly who they were, because they were all members of the local Jack and Jill Club, or the Girl Scouts. In other words, she doted over the ones whose families could afford to lay the foundations of social networking with those who mattered in the community. Coming from a working-class family, a girl like me certainly didn't matter, even in an all-black town. From Mrs. Horn, I learned the concept of black unity had exceptions. Many years later, I took a course in rhetoric, where an assignment provided the opportunity to explore my childhood disdain for Garvey. Would the depth of the dislike reach beyond his physical presentation once I peeled back the facade of his existence? What I found, among other things, was that Marcus Garvey held similar exceptions as my second grade teacher when it came to, quote-unquote, black unity. Despite being a master rhetorician, he was a shape-shifting, dark-skinned colorist who spoke from both sides of his mouth. Despite proving himself to be an important enemy of black America, who allied with white supremacists, all of his misdeeds have been forgotten, and he's been revised into a hero. My goal is to analyze and expose what has been forgotten about Mr. Garvey, so that young people can stop worshiping him as a saint of pan-africanism. When Mr. Garvey arrived in 1916, World War I was in full swing, and so was Jim Crow. Many West Indian immigrants began arriving and settling in Harlem, New York, after assisting with the building of the Panama Canal. Some of those same people continued to the United States to work in the factories. Garvey settled among the small but burgeoning West Indian community who lived among black American migrants arriving from the South. He was known to live on 129th Street in Harlem. In late 1925, Zora Neale Hurston reflected on her interactions with him in a satirical essay called "The Emperor Effaces Himself." She described his living room as having a large portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte on the wall, with an even larger portrait of himself on the opposing wall. It's difficult to imagine a black male enamored with an avowed racist who later became the inspiration for Adolf Hitler. Yet, the setting described alludes to him being a narcissist of sorts. And as delusional as it sounds, in a 1937 interview, Garvey claimed that he and his UNIA organization were the first fascists, and that Mussolini copied him. It makes one wonder how this admiration may have been incorporated into his hatred of light-skinned black people. Colorism was a part of Garvey's baggage. As a new arrival, he took issue with the presence of lighter-skinned blacks who were part of black leadership. This, of course, was a holdover from the slavery era that began when the mulatto children of white women were required to serve as slaves until the age of 30. Afterward, they were set free, becoming some of the first free people of color and designated as leaders of the community. However, once Jim Crow segregation became law in the late 1800s, we were all thrown into one caste based on as little as 1/8 of a drop of black blood. Our colorism became an internal whisper whose priority ranked way below white and black segregation and the systemic anti-black brutality that enforced it. It's not that colorism wasn't a problem. We just had bigger fish to fry, such as lynching, which was the chief focus of the NAACP at the time, and all complexions were being lynched. Such was not the case in Jamaica, where there was a tripartite color caste system comprised of whites at the top, mixed race in the middle, and dark-skinned blacks at the bottom. On the island, the British tended to extend more humanity to those with lighter skin than to the darker ones, which created an atmosphere of sharp social and economic divisions. Garvey transported the animosity and resentment between blacks and mulattoes with him to the United States. And upon seeing light-skinned blacks in desirable occupations and represented in societal leadership, the resentment seemed to grow as he established his Universal Negro Improvement Association and began advocating racial purity. Mulattoes represented a problem in terms of purity, and he looked down on them, no differently than the eugenicists and race scientists he would later befriend, such as Elsevier Cox. Strangely, however, in all of his advocacy of racial purity, his second wife, Amy Jacques, was a light-skinned black woman who would be considered a mulatto by Jamaican standards, although he made sure to reiterate to her that in the United States, any nigger is a nigger. It makes me wonder if his colorism was specific to black males, because he certainly had no problem marrying a woman with lighter skin. It's been said that when Garvey first arrived in the United States, he aimed to build a school in Jamaica, similar to the Tuskegee Institute. Booker T. Washington had died the previous year, so Garvey decided to seek out the advice of W.E.B. Du Bois with a visit to the NAACP office in New York. On that day, Du Bois was not present, yet Garvey was so disturbed by the presence of so many light-skinned people in the office that he stated that he was unable to tell whether or not he was in a white office or that of the NAACP. It begs the question as to whether he had ever seen a photo of Booker T. Washington, and how he would have reacted to his piercing blue eyes. In Garvey's mind, people who were not 100% black were inferior due to the intrusion of white blood and weren't to be trusted. I'd even say that it was the driving force behind his rift with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was lighter skinned. Du Bois recognized this when he stated in a 1920 article for The Crisis, "Garvey is an extraordinary leader of men." But it had been a mistake for him to try and bring Caribbean color politics to the United States. American Negroes recognized no color line in or out of the race. and in the end, they will punish the man who attempts to establish it, Du Bois wrote. To be very honest, Du Bois had a lot of nerve in making that statement, because there's always been colorism within Black America, whether or not it was the paper bag tests, the keen awareness of being a red bone or high yeller, or the featureism. Colorism has always had a niche, and was brought in with the keen physical differences between tribes such as the Fula, Bambara, Igbo, and Mandinkas who populated different states. It proliferated as admixture created even more differences in the reactions of those in power. Yet, as previously stated, there were bigger fish to fry. But that didn't stop Garvey from pushing his agenda of Black nationalism through the newspaper that he established, and the rift continued. It's one thing for colorism to be present within a community. It's another thing for an immigrant to come in with a new and improved version of it, to exploit intra-communitary division. In fact, most Black Americans at the time viewed him as a Caribbean carpetbagger, the man who marched around making speeches in a Napoleon suit while Black Wall Street burned. This was a man who pontificated about going to the African continent and telling the colonial powers to leave. Yet he made no appearances in the myriad of places where Blacks were being banished and murdered. If he had such a grand following of Black people, then why didn't he follow up his rhetoric with action? I believe that it was because he was exactly as W.E.B. Du Bois and many others described him, as a handkerchief head. Allegedly, one of Marcus Garvey's goals was to bring an end to imperialist rule and modernize Africa. For years after he'd arrived, his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, held a meeting on 18 August 1920. It convened at Liberty Hall on West 138th Street in Harlem. During this meeting, he elected himself Provisional President of Africa, because in his own words, no African was qualified to hold such a position. How is it that a man who had never set foot in any of the 54 countries on the African continent would have the audacity to hold such views? It was all rhetoric. As I say this, my mind drifts back to the poster staring at me from the wall. I now realize why he's looking at my golden brown face and the visible green veins on the underside of my hand with a look of disdain, I guess. But I digress. The expose will continue. One of the most overlooked aspects of his existence in the United States was his association with known white supremacists, which began with the Reverend Billy Sunday. It occurred after his first public speaking appearance, arranged by A. Philip Randolph. He was to address the Black community at St. Mark the Evangelist Church in Harlem, and it was a disaster. His nerves got the best of him, and he was booed and jeered until he fell off stage. It was devastating to him. But instead of wandering into some of the huge Black churches with well-known orators, such as Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. of Abyssinian Baptist Church, he instead chose the camp meetings of Reverend Billy Sunday. At the time, he was a very well-known evangelist who would set up tent revivals all across the country. When he came to New York, Garvey decided to attend and mimic his speaking style. Billy Sunday would always proudly assert that he believed in, quote-unquote, Protestantism, Americanism, and the supremacy of the white race. although it wasn't the only strange association that Garvey made. The moment proving him to be a veiled enemy of Black America occurred on June 25th, 1922. Garvey traveled to Georgia to spread his UNIA propaganda and arranged a meeting with the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan named E.Y. Clark. There they discussed the quote-unquote Negro problem and the promise of funding to remove Black Americans from the United States through his company, the Black Star Line. He left there with permission to freely distribute his UNIA material unmolested because they were well aware of the rift between him and W.E.B. Du Bois and sought to undermine the NAACP. Afterward, Garvey advocated acquiescing to the supremacy of the Klan in his speeches, stating, "This is the white man's country. He founded it. He conquered it, and we can't blame it if he wants to keep it." He went on to say, "I never built any streetcars or railroads. The white man built them for his own convenience. And if I don't want to ride where he's willing to let me ride, then I'd better walk." News of the meeting with Clark culminated in a series of meetings across the country known as the Garvey Must Go campaign. He was viewed as a race traitor. As the word of his behavior began to spread throughout the United States, various other Black leaders, such as the Interdenominational Black Pastors Alliance, actively voiced their dissent against a foreigner who was not only a race traitor, but organized a following that caused backlash to the Black community during an active lynching period. Garvey was later convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison in June of 1923. During his imprisonment, one of his visitors was Ernest Sevier Cox, a known white supremacist he collaborated with after he met with the Klan. After serving 3 years, Garvey's sentence was commuted by President Calvin Coolidge, and he was deported back to Jamaica. It was Cox's influence that led to the commutation of his sentence. Being unwelcomed in Jamaica, he moved to London and continued with his Universal Negro Improvement Organization. Yet, he continued to be a threat to Black America. In 1939, he was contacted by Senator Theodore Bilbo through his old friend, Ernest Sevier Cox, to assist in writing a bill called the Greater Liberia Bill. Said bill was introduced with the intent of involuntary mass deportation of Black Americans to an area of West Africa that was unclaimed by European powers. It was introduced in response to the attempts to pass the dire lynching bill advocated by the NAACP. It was Ernest Sevier Cox who stated, "One of the ways to deal with the NAACP is to support the Garvey movement." Senator Bilbo and Cox exploited the division and opposing views on repatriation. Garvey allowed himself to be a pawn in his quest for white validation. It matters not that he spoke about Black unity and empowerment if behind closed doors he allied against those he claimed to represent. The last thing that I'll mention are his views on Black Americans, written in an editorial that he wrote that was published in the New York Tribune. He attempted to assert why W.E.B. Du Bois objected to his Back to Africa movement by saying, quote unquote, Dr. Du Bois objects to this plan because he fails to take into consideration that the existing universal prejudice against Negroes is not so much because they are black, but because they have done nothing praiseworthy on their own initiative in the last 500 years to recommend them to serious consideration of progressive races. They have made no political, educational, industrial, independent contribution to civilization for which they can be respected by other races, thus making them unfit for free companionship and association with races which achieve greatness on their own initiative. This appeared in the New York Tribune in 1921. These were the words of an immigrant who came to the United States pontificating about a group of people of which he knew nothing about. In the words of Zora Neale Hurston, you don't know us Negroes. By the time of Garvey's arrival, there were plenty of contributions from Black Americans in the sciences, politics, and otherwise, but he didn't know the history. He just came in and started looking down his nose at Black Americans while pretending to be some kind of savior, while white supremacists cheered him on. I'm not surprised that Biden pardoned him before leaving office. Both he and his party thrive on the bigotry of low expectations, which is why they fight to keep DEI. They don't feel that blacks can thrive or achieve without their assistance. And when blacks do something great, it's almost as if they wish to keep the cloud of doubt above their heads by alluding to their presence behind every achievement. They believe exactly as Garvey believed. Sadly, America seems to have a pattern of lauding and buffering immigrants who come in and condemn or look down their noses at Black Americans. But again, I digress. Garvey was nothing more than a divisive clown who should have remained forgotten by Black America. Unfortunately, most are not that knowledgeable of the social-political carnage that he left in his path before getting deported. Instead, most people repeat narratives without question, and they dare not research for themselves. This includes the people who sought the pardon for Garvey, as well as President Biden, who pardoned him. In hindsight, I probably felt the spirit of that hypocrisy, colorism, and double-dealing emanating from the photo in my second grade classroom, accounting for my repulsion. And I'm also sure that there was a reason why the first Black president didn't move a finger when he was approached about pardoning Garvey. Thank you.